Hi friends, welcome back to the Birds of a Feather Talk Together podcast. Today, John, Shannon, Amanda, and I discuss the Sandhill Cranes. We discuss their massive migration and why they're now showing up in areas of the country where we didn't see them previously. We also discuss whether or not the reputation to mate for life is true. Do Sandhill Cranes cheat? Get your popcorn ready. In addition to the cranes, we also discuss a Ruby Crowned Kinglet that we've been seeing recently and answer some listener mailbag questions about peacocks. I also want to remind you about our Instagram page. We'll be posting pictures of some of the bird specimen along with each episode. We have pictures of the ivory-billed woodpecker, birds of paradise, and a woodcock up there now. Be sure to check them out at Birds of a Feather Podcast, each word separated by underscores. Now, grab your binoculars. Let's get into the episode. Well, so have you seen any good birds recently? Has there been any good sightings, or how's the spring been going for everybody so far?
Yeah, I like this time of year because you're seeing the first young. So I go to a place called Memorial Park Cemetery up in Skokie, and there's a brood of 10 wood duck chicks with a female on one of the ponds there. And the last couple of years I've been able to watch them grow up, and sometimes you see some of them disappear, but one year they fledged nine young ducklings that got off that pond, and then that's kind of amazing thing to see.
Yeah, wow, that's awesome.
I might be more local. I love the fact that our yard comes to life with both plants and sounds, and I love the shifting of sounds that come in through the windows, especially with this work from home. A lot of the time I have the windows open at this time of year, and I can hear the changing of the birds as they come through, white-crowned sparrows, for example. So it's fun.
Yeah.
So you guys were telling us about the kinglet you guys had.
Yeah. So we had one that was, he was there for about a week, I'd say.
Yeah.
And every morning.
Yeah.
But it was like every morning he would tap on the window and I'd be at work and Amanda would hear him tapping and she'd send pictures of him and we'd see him crowning and see his little red feathers on top of his head. And eventually one day on the weekend I was finally home and I got to see him, and then it was like all morning we were looking out the window. It was great. We were sad when he left.
Yes, yeah.
And that's the amazing thing is, that bird could be someplace up in central Manitoba right now.
Wow.
On a territory. This is what happens with migration this time of year, which is so cool. And it's neat that's another thing that we'll get into over the course of some of the birds we talk about. But the stopover ecology, the idea that you had that bird for a week, probably means that it was building up to take the next step on its migration, and so spend some time in Chicago.
Okay, wow.
We wondered about that.
Yeah.
What he was doing, why he wanted to come into our house.
And then we thought we heard him like a week later in like the backside of our house, and we were like, "Is he close by?"
Yeah.
He just moved to a different tree, but I think he went up.
I do too. I think
kept on with his migration.
It was wishful thinking.
Yeah,
he was still around.
A lot of birds increase their body weight dramatically with fat during migration, and then they burn it off as they go. And if they burn down their reserves, they have to stop. And sometimes it takes them, several days to get up enough reserves again to complete their journey.
Okay.
But I also love the fact that this time of year the males are already getting ready to breed, so I'm assuming it was looking at its reflection and seeing something that it wanted to keep off its territory and keep out of its own space. And so it's a fun time of year that way.
If you went outside and looked at your windows from the outside, you probably would have seen a very strong reflection from the outside. So that bird was competing against itself for space.
Amanda kept moving the blinds up and down to try to, she was like, I don't want to stress him out. So she would pull the blinds down, but maybe he was seeing his reflection more. So we weren't sure what the right thing to do was.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
And I showed a lot of people the pictures, and a big question was why he would show his crown at some points and then at not others. And then we've seen other birds that have crowns, like the green heron we saw this weekend. Why do birds display their crowns sometimes and not other times?
Yeah, I think so. There's sexual dimorphism, meaning males and females look different in Ruby Crowned Kinglets, and so that red crown is something that the males use for displays, but at the same time, they're a small sort of bird that's going to want to be inconspicuous. So there's probably been selection over time for male Ruby Crowned Kinglets to cover up that crown and make it concealed, just because it's a little safer for them to be a Ruby Crowned Kinglet at that point.
Okay.
But you can flash it to show A, what species you are, B, that you're a male, and C, that this is my space, so bug off.
And there's an interesting irony there. So as I say that, there's another species, the other species of kinglet in North America, golden crowned kinglet, actually doesn't have a concealed crown.
Okay.
And so it's interesting that you've got it in one species and not in the other.
Yeah, and it was crazy how well he could conceal it. It was like when he would show up in the morning, I thought it was a different bird, and then all of a sudden you'd start to see it a little bit more, and then he would show it, and then it would retract too. Like, and we could get so close to him that you could kind of see him go through this whole cycle. It was really cool to see.
Yeah, and all that's about, there's muscles in the base of the feathers that are allowing them to actually do all that, which is really neat.
Wow. Well, I think we want to talk a little bit about the Sandhill Cranes and get into them a little bit, speaking of migrations. And so I think last time we were together, we talked a little bit about, so I grew up in like the western suburbs of Chicago and never saw any Sandhill Cranes growing up. And now that we're kind of in the northern suburbs, I'm starting to see them a lot more. And I think you were saying that might be more of a factor of like their population growing, that they're doing better than kind of location. So they're kind of like a success story you were saying last time. Is that true?
Yeah, and the thing about Sandhill Cranes is they have they're another one of these species that has a very large geographic distribution across North America. So they breed from Alaska and all across Canada, where there are these migrant populations. And then in addition, they've got populations that are breeding in the Midwest. And they've also got populations that don't migrate down in Florida and Cuba.
Oh, wow.
And so it's an interesting bird in terms of its flexibility associated with that. And in the Midwest, I think that as Europeans first came across eastern North America, they're good to eat, apparently. They were hunted.
They had beautiful feathers that were often used in women's clothing and hats and things like that.
And I think the populations definitely dropped. They don't have a high reproductive rate. They lay only a couple eggs at a time. So they're the kind of species that you would expect to have trouble. They're actually doing an awful lot better than whooping cranes are numerically, and yet. So they're a spectacular bird in the Chicago area. And then as you were noting, you can go up to places like Middle Fork, Savannah, where you guys have been, and they're breeding Sandhill Cranes in that area, and you'll actually see them fly around when you go up there and spend a little time, and that's just incredible.
Yeah, we've seen them in Highland Park even. It's somewhere near us, and I mean it's incredible, and you can definitely hear them flying overhead too.
Sure, when spring when they're moving and the wind is right, you can get large numbers on spring and fall migration coming through the Chicago region. And that's something that I think has been augmented by the population increases in the Midwest.
Okay.
I think we know these things a lot because of technology. So when there's Sandhill Cranes that are coming over like that, our friends will text us in other places telling us, and if the person's north, pretty soon they're going to be over your house too. And so you get you can communicate a lot more about these things with recording devices. People can figure out what they are when they might not have historically known how to figure out what that giant bird in the sky.
And they migrate in massive groups, right?
They can,
it's like these
sure.
thousands of them all travel together.
And one of the greatest things about them is their voice.
Oh, yeah.
And so I like having been in the front yard and hearing them, and then it takes a couple minutes before the flock actually arrives and comes over, and it's just one of the best feelings to sit there and go, oh man, there's going to be a flock of 30 or 40 of these big birds with their necks straight out and their legs behind them, and they'll often stop and catch thermals, and so they'll circle for a little bit before they head on. I actually think they try to avoid the city in part because it's a little difficult for them to fly over, but then depending on the wind patterns, they can get pushed along the shore of the lake. And
okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
And then when they land, I mean, they're such an interesting looking bird. They're gorgeous, like the red feathers around their eyes and their kind of slender like legs. I mean, when you see them, you're like, it jumps out. It looks different than anything else we see around here.
Definitely thought of as some of the most graceful and elegant birds that are alive.
And the whole family's like that. So one of the things people will always say about cranes is they're species all over the world, and they're really revered in almost everywhere that they occur, even if they haven't been protected quite as well as they should be in a lot of those places.
That's one of the things that I was looking up how many we had. We have 172 specimens. The oldest one is in, I think, 1883 or something like that, in the 1880s. But the one thing, if you look at our database at the Field Museum online, is that we have a really super duper old taxonomy. And so if you want to search, you have to go back in time to remember what the taxonomy is before you can search. And so I tried to find them. I'm like, okay, this is ridiculous. And then I was looking under Antigone, which is their new genus, and they used to be under Grus. And so if you look in our database, you have to put in Grus. But then I thought, why are they called? What is Antigone? What is that? And there's people who have there were a few people who have written, even some fairly well-known ornithologists who wrote that they thought it had to do with their bare neck, because Antigone was Oedipus's daughter, and she was known for her fidelity, for her honor. And when she was asked to do something that was not honorable, she was both imprisoned, and then before she could be let go by her father, she hanged herself. And so the whole neck part of it. But I don't think that's what it is. I think that because she was also thought of and revered, that her fidelity, her honor were so important, that I think that's why this bird is named that way, because cranes have that reputation. That's kind of how they're viewed across a lot of different cultures, is for their grace and their elegance. And they mate for life, which is sweet at some level, but we know a lot of things that we thought mated for life don't. So there's a lot of cheating in the bird world. I don't know. Has anybody done a study of whether Sandhill Cranes cheat?
So not that I know of. There's there's a whole field of study about extra pair copulations, which is the scientific term for it. I would guess that cranes which is interesting because during spring and fall migration, they are in these big flocks. I presume the pairs are there in those situations, so that I presume they migrate together. And yet they come up to Wisconsin or northern Illinois, and suddenly that's what you'll see is two birds in a field, and that's the pair. So I don't know. I don't wonder.
I meant to look it up, but I don't know if
some of those
anybody
things are
knows
hard
that. But it's been the use of DNA technology to explore nesting behavior has been revelatory to show that the social father is often not the biological father of young in a nest, for example. So, females are choosing mates, sometimes more than one, to put eggs in the same nest, maybe for different characteristics. Maybe one is very good at helping at the nest, but the other one dances better, and they want to make sure that their offspring have a lot of genetic variability so that they themselves as females have their, genes perpetuated more. But
and Shannon, are you talking about cranes specifically or all types of birds?
No, I'm talking about all types of birds. So everywhere we've looked, we've realized that mating for life is a nice concept, but
I would say
there's not so much of a reality.
I was going to say not everywhere, but cranes would be one of those places where I think people might not look immediately just because the pair bond seems to be so strong during the breeding grounds. So the male participates in incubation, and they do this mating ritual where they have a bunch of complex dances. One of the neat things about the Midwest is up in Baraboo, Wisconsin, is the International Crane Foundation. And so there's a spectacular place that was created by this one guy, George Archibald, and it's been his vision to have this facility to help rear cranes to conserve them all over the world. And so it's a really interesting place to visit that's not that far away.
Oh, wow.
Very cool.
Cool. And then, so Nebraska is so famous for the cranes, obviously, like that's where most of them go through. I mean, what is it about Nebraska versus, now we're seeing them in Wisconsin and Illinois? I mean, I know that Nebraska is where most of them kind of filter through.
So it's interesting. They have all these different migration routes. Mm-hmm. And so Nebraska is one area, and then from Nebraska, I think they go on to a place called Cheyenne Bottoms, which is in Kansas, which is another big area. And the birds here, actually, a lot of them go to a place called Jasper-Pulaski Wildlife Area in Indiana. And so there can be, in these places, there are thousands and thousands of cranes during the right period of time when they're there. And so, again, I just think it's, at some level, it's safety in numbers. It's places where they can roost and not be bothered too much, and then go out and find food before they move on their migration route. And so all these places are destinations for birders a lot of times to go when the cranes are moving. And it's definitely something to see that many big birds in a given area.
National Geographic has some fantastic migration maps that they've put out throughout the years that show very clearly what the migration routes are in birds, actually throughout the world, but there's been several versions of a North American map that can help you understand why there are funnels where a lot of things kind of get concentrated together during their migration routes. I love maps, but I love those maps. I think they're really pretty amazing. And awesome. Some of these birds, I mean, just think about a tiny bird migrating from the North Pole to the South Pole. Mm-hmm. It's really astonishing.
Yes. Yeah.
It was interesting. You said some of the Sandhill cranes, that there's ones that don't migrate that are in, did you say Florida and
in Cuba?
In Cuba?
Yeah, there's a population on Cuba.
Why is it that those ones wouldn't? I mean, I know that's a big question, but...
I mean, so there are a bunch of different questions. So one is, do they just stop, or do other individuals just stop? And so it's a population genetic question. In other words, maybe what happened was, over evolutionary time, a group of birds stopped migrating and have become genetically distinct. And I think the Cuban and the Florida birds are considered both different subspecies.
Okay.
And so that implies there may be a little bit of genetic structure, although I don't know that it's that much. And yeah, I mean, this is an area of active interest, is like, why do that? And I think a lot of it comes back to why not? I mean, migration has lots of problems associated with it. And so if you're a Sandhill crane and you think you can make a go of it and you can find a mate, you might establish a population in a place like Cuba. And for all I know, Cuba may be the result of overshooting of migrant Sandhill cranes that wintered in Florida. And now you're on an island where you've got to figure out whether you want to cross a big body of water to try to get to some place that you may or may not be there.
I mean, I think there's a lot of variation in resilience of species to changes, whether that's making a behavioral choice to not migrate. And I think we're going to see a lot of that with climate change in the future. We're going to be seeing the resilience of species and likely some pretty dramatic changes in migratory behavior as well. There are things that are stay year-round, hummingbirds, for example, that are in Louisiana that weren't there 50 years ago. But as it warms up and there are feeders places, some birds are making the choice to overwinter in places where they wouldn't have historically. And I think that with climate change, there are going to be a lot of changes like this, and not necessarily by choice, but by necessity. If migrating becomes even more stressful because the planet's getting warmer, you're going to figure out through evolutionary time, short periods of evolutionary time, that it's better to stay somewhere than it is to try to go. And it could be that the wintering grounds then have food items that they didn't before that make it more likely that you can survive over the winter. Chicago's getting a lot better in the winter. I hate to say that, but it's true. There's there's a lot of ameliorating of the climate in Chicago.
Well, and then there's also the historical facts, which are that during the height of the ice ages, this was all ice where we're doing this show, and it's easy to forget that there probably was very few pockets of usable habitat for things like Sandhill Cranes north of here then. So what did they do? Well, in all likelihood, they were breeding much farther south at that point, and then expanded north as the ice receded and these areas opened up to them. And so all those kinds of questions are really interesting from the perspective of understanding movement biology and have a lot of different factors as you go over time.
John's had a number of students who have studied migration and the properties of migrating birds and changes through time. It's really fascinating.
So could there be a group of cranes then that would just decide one year, we're not going to do it? And there's examples, current examples of that. Where
as long as they survived in a condition to breed, then, their offspring are going to learn that they don't have to go anywhere either. Okay. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting because the thing I can't get my mind around is why wouldn't you have continual influx of other individuals? Mm-hmm. And if you have that, you shouldn't become genetically differentiated. And yet, in lots of these situations, what we see is genetic differentiation actually evolves over time. So that could be that natural selection is pushing genes in that population because they're in a novel environment during the breeding season that requires a bunch of things. It could be genetic drift, but it could also be that there was something climatically important that led there to be a period of time where there wasn't even a possibility of exchange in some place. So Cuba is a good example because that Cuban population, in all likelihood, is not receiving any influx of individuals from the North American migrant populations with any regularity because they'd be making a mistake to do it. Mm-hmm. Now, I was going to point out that I was thinking about this. I spent this time in Bermuda recently doing field work, and in preparing for that trip, I was looking through the literature, and there are fossil cranes known from Bermuda.
Oh, wow.
And so they probably got pushed out there at some point and were on this tiny little island.
Think about that. Bermuda's in the middle of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
How on earth does that happen?
Yeah.
And again, the interesting things about cranes too, which is good with respect to essentially colonizing a new place, is they fly in flocks. Mm. If you're an individual bird and you show up someplace, you've got no mate. Mm. But cranes at some level, if they can stay aloft, are predisposed to be able to actually do pretty well. Now, at the same time, it's kind of surprising that there aren't any cranes in South America. Mm. So they've never got there, and yet they're in Africa, they're in Australia, and they're all the way through Asia and Europe too.
We may find crane fossils in South America someday.
It's an interesting thing.
Because there's always these things that blow your mind about fossils, where things are. There are lots of herons in South America. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Shannon just brought up something I wanted to ask. So RJ and I, we were at the Skokie Lagoons last weekend and saw a lot of blue herons flying, and they're really easy to identify when you see them in the sky. But sometimes we would see them just for a little bit fly with their necks out, but usually it was all crunched up. And that's something I love about the Sandhill Crane is it's really distinctive when you look up and its neck is long out and its legs are long out. Why do they fly that way versus like a heron who kind of crunches itself up?
Yeah, good question. And all the cranes do that. I don't know that there's a really solid hypothesis for why they wouldn't.
Amanda had an idea.
Okay, good. Let's hear it.
You don't remember? You had a really good point when we were looking at it. You thought when the heron was flying with its neck out straight that we could hear it vocalizing.
That's true.
And then when it crunched its neck up, we couldn't hear it anymore. So it was like it had its neck extended and we could hear it. And then once it crunched its neck up. And so cranes are so vocal.
Well, and they have a spectacular tracheal system. In other
They
words,
do,
it
actually.
comes down and it actually comes all the way back up. In there, so that very well may be.
That's part of their
explanation.
mating behaviors. That's part of their life is to have.
I was going to throw out the idea
But I
on
don't
the
know.
heron side of things that cranes kind of walk around and stick their head down and grab stuff, and they'll eat. They eat a lot of grain, but they'll eat if they see a baby killdeer, for instance, or a mouse, they'll eat stuff like that. Herons are actually jabbing at stuff. And so I sometimes wonder if because of the nature of that jabbing evolution, it just makes sense to curl your neck when you're flying because it's a little dangerous to not do it.
Yeah, 'cause you
I mean,
need
they
it.
might
Yeah.
have different muscles.
Yeah.
For,
it'd be-
I mean,
yeah.
this is out of my area, so we can speculate wildly all we want without data. But yeah, it could be that they have the capacity to do that,
Yeah.
and cranes don't have the capacity to
Okay.
do that. I
It
don't
is-
know.
It is an absolutely terrific field mark
Yes,
between
it
the
certainly
two.
is.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the great blue was not doing that and it was calling because I think that's that works for me.
Okay. Good job. Should we jump into some mailbag questions before we wrap it up?
Sure.
So this first one is from Nav from West Sacramento, California. And so she says, in my hometown of West Sacramento, we live in a rural area with lots of farms. For as long as I can remember, we've had peacocks walking around our neighborhood. Rumor has it a bird enthusiast let them free range. They eventually mated and now have about 30 plus peacocks roaming the streets and flying on the rooftops. When I lived in Los Angeles, I would routinely see a flock of parrots flying around. Same backstory. My question is, do non-migratory birds typically just thrive where they end up, or would they still try to migrate somewhere more specific to their particular species' needs? If I brought some flamingos to Sacramento, would they try to get back somewhere more tropical or just stay where they are and consider that home?
So that's a terrific question without an entirely simple answer. Introduced birds are bizarre experiments. They're peacocks in Miami, for instance, and that's definitely a non-migratory bird, so they're not going to go anywhere, and they're probably not going to evolve migration to leave there. But what I'm thinking of is a bird like European goldfinch, which one of our students is beginning to study, and some of the populations of European goldfinch are definitely migratory. But coming back to the idea of Bermuda, the reason we went there was to study European goldfinches that have been out there for 150 years, introduced by humans, couldn't get off the island, and so they're living there and they're not migrating. So I think, this is something that there's probably some genetic underpinnings there has to be genetic underpinnings to migration in a lot of ways in order to do some of the crazy things that Shannon was talking about that birds do. And yet at the same time, if things are good or if you can survive, you probably want to have the capacity to override those genes and just stay in a place too. And the evidence suggests that there are species that actually have had that happen over their evolutionary history.
I think of parrots in that context because there's lots of parrots that kind of escape and get all over the place, and a lot of, the instinctive thing is I think that parrots are tropical, right? But they're not all tropical. So there are some that live in the southern parts of South America, for example, and that's the lineage that's giving us the parrots that are in Hyde Park, for example, right? So they're in an environment that is not tropical, but their ancestry is not from a tropical place. And you think about, we used to have Carolina parakeets, and so even though now we think of most parrots being tropical birds, and TV shows have you thinking of them like that too, but that's not really the case. So there's a lot of things that go into whether or not an introduced taxon can last, and most of them go extinct. They can make a population, it lasts for a little while, it goes extinct. So there used to be an establishing population around Evanston where we live of parrots, and but through the last 10, 15 years since our son stopped playing baseball, they don't exist up there in the same way anymore. And goldfinches, there used to be a population of European goldfinches on Long Island, and it went extinct too. So I think there's a lot of kind of ebbing and flowing of these things that more than we know.
Yeah, we have a student who's at the University of Chicago in the Department of Ecology and Evolution who's studying parrots that have been introduced in lots of different places like California. And one of the things that he was looking at the niches in their native range and trying to understand how that correlated with where they survived. And the one thing that I've always taken away from the work he's doing is that for the most part, none of these parrot species ever leave the urban areas they're in. And I think the urban areas provide them with a lot of introduced plants that may be able to provide forage, and they're going to feeders and things like that. And so that's a big factor, which means they're probably not going to start migrating, because if they migrate, they'd have to find some place that actually was similar and that may not be out there.
Okay. And they're not hunted in most urban environments too, right? If you put something like that outside of the city, they could easily be shot with a shotgun and things like that. But, peregrine falcons are pretty safe in urban environments now, nesting on ledges and things like that. They're not being hunted. Not being shot. I mean, people are getting shot, but not wildlife. And those aren't the same.
Safer to be a bird.
That's not the same gun that you would use to take down a peregrine falcon. But yeah, so urban environments are safer. The long-term effects of light pollution are things that we're just starting to think about, but don't have any data on. But so there are issues, stress associated with urban environments. John's had a student who studied the influence of urban environments on birds in Peru, and it's pretty stressful. And there are things I think that we can do from a city planning perspective to making corridors of connections of habitat that lower the stress of birds. And I don't know about light pollution, but light pollution costs people too, not just seeing the northern lights and things like that, because we don't do that. We can't do that here because it's too much light in the sky.
So I've seen that with let's say deer that are migrating, where they have over a freeway, they'll put a pass where they can go over. Is there anything for birds that can help with migration in an urban environment? Is there anybody that's come up with any ideas to try to?
Well, you can. There are natural experiments in the Chicago area that are just spectacular, which is that in a sense we've got these forest preserve landscapes all along the rivers, and so there's actually native vegetation. So if you're a forest bird, a migrating warbler, I mean, obviously there are very clear challenges associated with the buildings, but those rivers and the vegetation along both banks allow things to move north and south really easily.
Okay.
And so those are So there's a lot of evidence associated with what green spaces mean. And one of the things I've always loved about Chicago is I had no idea before I got here how much green space there was actually within the city limits.
Yeah.
It's really amazing.
We're lucky we live near the Skokie Swift L tracks, and the vegetation associated with that, I think, is one of the reasons why we have a lot of birds in our yard. So there are a lot of places you don't think of that provide habitat for wildlife, not just rats, but provide habitat, even nesting sites, which we know that the birds are nesting in the Skokie Swift track, the area just on the other side of the tracks. Cool. So there are lots of places that, are semi-wildlife that people just don't think of, right?
Yeah. Okay. That's awesome. Well, I think that's about it for time for today. So I think we got to call it at that. So thanks everyone for listening. Is there anything that anyone wants to add?
Nope.
All right.
We
Thanks,
don't have
everyone.
a good way of ending these podcasts.
I know. We're going to have to.
Do we?
I'm going to say go birding every single time.
I was waiting for you, John.
Well, I didn't want to get redundant.
Yeah.
No,
you can say it again, and we'll add it. We'll add it.
standard message.
I
Yeah,
agree.
yeah.
And it should come from you.
All right.
Yeah.
You can say it again and I'll edit it in.
There we go. Go birding.
Thanks everyone for listening. Just a reminder that you can reach out to us at podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com with your mailbag questions. We wanted to thank Earhole Studios in Chicago for allowing us to record at your studios. We appreciate the help. We've been receiving a ton of great feedback, so thank you to everyone for listening and for your continued support. We're still trying to get the word out there, so if you've enjoyed our podcast, please spread the word and let somebody know about us. We have more episodes dropping every week, so please subscribe and continue to listen. Thanks, everyone.